All right, hello everyone. So we have a story here that we will read. Okay, so this is still about AWS, and the story goes like this. And this is also a story and a question. Empowering our rising star within the company ranks. A developer has recently earned a well-deserved promotion to the esteemed role of team lead. With this newfound responsibility comes the pivotal task of spearheading code deployment operations on EC2 instances, orchestrated through the sophisticated platforms of AWS Code Commit and AWS Code Deploy. In alignment with our ever-evolving standards, the deployment process must now possess the capability to dynamically adjust permissions for deployed files, according to the critical function of verifying deployment success. In light of these imperative requirements, what strategic steps should our newly appointed team lead prioritize to ensure the seamless evolution of our deployment workflow? Okay, so we are going to copy this and put this to find. Oh no, not that one. This one here. This smart little guy. Help me answer this question. Okay. Okay, to ensure the seamless evolution of our deployment workflow with the new requirements for dynamically adjusting permissions for deployed files and verifying deployment success, the newly appointed team lead should prioritize the following strategic steps. Leverage AWS Code Deploy Lifecycle Events. Utilize the lifecycle events provided by AWS Code Deploy to dynamically adjust permissions for deployed files. Specifically, the after install lifecycle event can be used to execute scripts that modify the file permissions after the deployment files have been copied to the final destination folder. So in after install lifecycle event, it can be used to execute scripts that modify file permissions after the deployment files has been copied to the final destination. Okay, so after you deploy the files to the final destination, you can use the script to change the file permissions. Okay, implement deployment validation. Okay, implement deployment validation. To verify deployment success, the validate service lifecycle event can be used. This event is the last in the deployment lifecycle and is designed to verify that the deployment was completed successfully. It can be configured to call a Lambda function that performs validation checks and reports back to co-deploy whether the deployment was successful or not. Optimize deployment configurations. Review. Okay, optimize deployment configuration. Review and optimize the deployment configurations in co-deploy to ensure they are tailored to the needs of your application and infrastructure. This includes setting appropriate success and failure conditions that align with your deployment strategy. Integrate with AWS Co Auto Scaling. If your app okay, integrate with AWS Auto Scaling. If your application is deployed across an auto scaling group, ensure that co-deploy is configured to automatically deploy the latest application revision to new instances launched by auto scaling. This requires specifying the auto scaling group name in the deployment group configuration and ensuring the co-deploy agent is installed in the auto scaling instances. Monitor and adjust. Regularly monitor the deployment process using AWS CloudWatch and other monitoring tools to identify any issues or bottlenecks. Use this data to adjust your deployment configurations and scripts as needed to ensure optimal performance and reliability. By focusing on these strategic steps, the team lead can enhance the deployment workflow to meet the evolving standards of the company, ensuring efficient and reliable deployments across EC2 instances. Okay, so these are its sources working with deployment configuration and co-deploy. You should read AWS configurations or AWS documentation like a Bible, man. Oh man, this is too much for me. I'm digging my own grave in this one. Okay, so working with deployment configurations in co-deploy. A deployment configuration is a set of rules and success and failure conditions used by co-deploy during a deployment configuration. Okay. These rules and conditions are different depending on whether you deploy to an EC2 on-premise compute platform, AWS Lambda compute platform, or Amazon ECS compute platform. Deployment configurations on an EC2 on-premises compute platform. When you deploy to an EC2 on-premises compute platform, the deployment configuration specifies through the use of minimum healthy host value and the optimal minimum healthy host per zone value, the number of percentage of instances that must remain available at any time during a deployment. You can use one of these three predefined deployment configurations provided by AWS or create a custom deployment configuration. For more information about creating custom deployment configuration, see create a deployment configuration. If you don't specify a deployment configuration, co-deploy uses the co-deploy default one at a time deployment configuration. Right, for more information about how co-deploy monitors and evaluates health instance during a deployment, see instance health. To view a list of deployment configurations already registered to your AWS account, see View Deployment Configuration Details. Oh man, oh man, deployment configurations all at once and place deployment, blue-green deployment all at once, deployment configuration all at once, and place deployment and blue and green deployment half at a time, and place deployment, blue-green one at a time. So this is the default, right? One at a time, place deployment, blue-green deployment. So let's read what is here. In place deployments attempts to deploy an application if it's all at once, attempts to deploy an application revision as to as many instances as possible at once. The status of the overall deployment is displayed as succeeded if the application revision is deployed to one or more of the instances. The status of the overall deployment is displayed as failed if the application revision is not deployed to any of the instances. Using an example of 9 instances, code deploy default dot all at once attempts to deploy to all 9 instances at once. The overall deployment succeeds if deployment to even a single instance is successful. It fails only if deployments to all 9 instances failed. Okay, so it succeeds if one of the instances has been fully deployed to. For That is for all at once and in place deployment. So for blue green deployments, deployment to replacement environment follows the same deployment rules as co-deploy all at once for in place deployments. Traffic rerouting routes traffic to all instances in the replacement environment at once. Succeeds if traffic is successfully rerouted to at least one instance. Fails after rerouting to all instances fails. Okay, so at least if one of the instances has been deployed to, then it already succeeds. Okay, half at a time deploys to up to half of the instances at a time with fractions rounded down. The overall deployment succeeds if the application revisions is deployed to at least half of the instances with fractions rounded up. Otherwise, the deployment fails. In the example of 9 instances, it deploys to up to 4 instances at a time. The overall deployment succeeds if deployment to 5 or more instances succeeds. Alright, so it will only succeed if more than half, like half, but rounded up will be will succeed. Otherwise, the deployment fails. So if half at a time for 9 instances, the deployment is only successful to 4 instances, then the deployment fails. If you're deploying 2 instances in multiple auto-scaling groups, co-deploy will deploy to up to half of the instances at a time, regardless of the auto-scaling groups they're in. For example, let's assume you have two auto-scaling group 1 and auto-scaling group 2, each with 10 instances. In this scenario, co-deploy might deploy to 10 instances in just AES auto-scaling group 1 and consider this a success because it has deployed to at least half of the instances. Alright, so half of the instances because we are 20 because each has 10 instances and you already succeeded in auto scaling group 1, and even if you didn't succeed in auto scaling group 2, the co-deploy will consider this as a success because it's half has already been deployed to. Okay, so for the blue green deployment to replacement environments follows the same deployment rules as co-deploy default dot half at a time for instance deployments. For in-place deployments, traffic rerouting routes traffic to up to half the instances in the replacement environment at a time succeeds if rerouting to at least half of the instance succeeds, otherwise fails. In-place deployments. Okay, one at a time deploys the application revision to only one instance at a time. For deployment groups that contain more than one instance, oh, yep, the overall deployment succeeds if the application revision is deployed to all of the instances. The exception to this rule is that if deployment to the last instance fails, the overall deployment still succeeds. Yeah, this is because co-deploy allows only one instance at a time to be taken offline with the co-deploy default dot one at a time configuration. So yeah, for example, if you have 9 instances, then one failed at the last part, then this will still be considered as a success. The overall deployment fails as soon as the application revision fails to deploy to any but the last instance. As the application revision fails to deploy to any but the last. Okay, so if the last succeeds and any fails, then that sucks. That will be considered as a failure. Overall deployment fails. Okay. An example using the 9 instances, it deploys to one instance at a time. The overall deployment succeeds if deployment to the last the first 8 instances is successful. The overall deployment fails if deployment to any of the first 8 instances fails. If deployment to any of the first 8 instances fails. So if any of the first 8 instances fails, so if, for example, first instance it fails, then it will automatically fail, right? And for if all of the 8 succeeds and then the last part fails, still consider it as a success because yeah, you only need to have one offline instance. Okay, for deployment groups that contains only one instance, the overall deployment is successful only if deployment to the single instance is successful. All right, for the blue-green deployments, deployment to replacement environment for follows same deployment rules as co-deploy default all at once for in-place deployments, traffic rerouting routes traffic to one instance in the replacement environment at one at a time. Succeeds if traffic is successfully rerouted to all replacement instances. Fails after the very first rerouting failure. The exception to this rule is that if the last instance fails to register, the overall deployment still succeeds. Yeah, still the same logic with our policy with the in-place deployment. So deployment configuration on the Amazon EC2 compute platform. Oh man, this is so long. Okay, I'll go now. All right, thanks. Bye.